My name is Matilda Carter. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of person people describe with words that sound polite, but usually mean forgettable, responsible, quiet, reliable. The kind of person who shows up early, listens more than she talks, and somehow ends up carrying the extra weight when nobody else volunteers. I live in Portland, Oregon, and on paper, my life is fairly ordinary. I work as an administrative coordinator for a small non-profit. I organize documents, keep calendars running, and make sure things don't fall apart when other people get distracted. It's not glamorous work, but I've always believed that the quiet parts of life matter just as much as the loud ones. Still, people rarely notice the person who keeps things steady. Growing up, I was often the calm one in the family, the one who didn't argue, the one who could be trusted to handle difficult conversations with patience, the one relatives would turn to when something needed to be handled quietly and responsibly. And if I'm being honest, I think some people slowly mistook that patience for something else. For years, certain members of my family assumed I would always stay in the background, that I would accept whatever role they handed me, that I would smile politely while decisions were made over my head. I didn't argue with them, at least not at first. The story I'm about to tell you isn't about revenge or shouting matches or dramatic confrontations. Real life rarely unfolds that way. What actually happens, most of the time, is much quieter. A small moment of disrespect, then another, then a pattern that slowly becomes normal. Until one day, something happens that forces you to look at the entire situation differently. For me, that moment began with a family announcement. My aunt, confident, decisive, and very used to being the loudest voice in the room, gathered everyone together and calmly informed us that she was selling my grandmother's house. Just like that, the house where 4 generations of our family had gathered for holidays. The place where my grandmother had lived for nearly 60 years. The place where, for reasons no one seemed to remember anymore, I had quietly spent the most time helping her during the final years of her life. To most people in the room, it sounded like a simple logistical decision. To me, it felt like the closing of a door. But the real turning point didn't happen in the living room that afternoon. It happened weeks later, in a quiet office, at a long wooden table, with a notary public, a stack of documents, and a single question that nobody in the room was expecting. A question so simple, it almost sounded harmless. But when the notary asked it, the entire atmosphere changed. And my aunt realized, a little too late, that the story she thought she was telling wasn't the real one at all. She wasn't ready for the answer. Before we get there, though, you need to understand something important. You need to understand who I was to them before any of this began. Because sometimes, the person everyone overlooks is the only one who was paying attention the whole time. So before we continue, I'm curious about something. Have you ever been in a situation where people underestimated you simply because you were quiet? For most of my life, the role people assigned to me was simple. I was the dependable one. Every family has someone like that. The person everyone calls when something needs to be organized, fixed, scheduled, explained, or quietly handled without turning it into a scene. In our family, that person was me. Not because I volunteered for the role, but because somewhere along the way, it just became expected. If a holiday dinner needed planning, I made the lists. If grandma needed groceries, I picked them up. If someone had paperwork they didn't understand, they handed it to me with a relieved smile. Matilda's good with this kind of thing. People said it like a compliment. And in some ways, I suppose it was. I've always liked solving practical problems. I enjoy order. I like the quiet satisfaction of helping things run smoothly when everything else feels chaotic. But there's a strange side effect to becoming the reliable one. The more dependable you are, the more invisible you go. When you're the loudest person in the room, people notice you. When you're the one quietly making everything work, people assume things would run fine without you. My Aunt Carolyn was the opposite of me in almost every way. Where I spoke carefully, she spoke confidently. Where I preferred listening, she preferred directing. Where I hesitated before making decisions, she made them quickly, and rarely questioned them afterward. She wasn't cruel and she wasn't a villain, but she had something many confident people develop over time. The assumption that her version of reality was the obvious one. Carolyn had always been the family organizer. The one who announced plans, settled disagreements, and decided how things should move forward. And because she spoke with certainty, people usually followed. My mother often said Carolyn had leadership energy. I think what she meant was that Carolyn filled the silence quickly. And silence makes many people uncomfortable. I've never been afraid of silence. which might be why people sometimes mistook me for someone who had nothing to say. The person who saw me most clearly was my grandmother. Her name was Eleanor Carter. She had lived in the same old craftsman-style house in Portland for nearly 60 years. The house wasn't grand or especially valuable by modern standards, but it held something more important to her than money. It held memory. Every floorboard had a story. Every cupboard had been opened by generations of our family. When I was younger, I spent long afternoons there after school while my parents worked late. Grandma had a quiet way of noticing things. She noticed when people were tired but pretending not to be. She noticed when someone was carrying more responsibility than others realized. And she noticed that I was the one who stayed when everyone else eventually left. In her later years, when the stairs became harder and the errands became heavier, I began stopping by more often. At first, it was once a week, then twice. Eventually, it became almost routine. I'd bring groceries, sort through mail, and help her review medical forms she didn't fully understand anymore. Nothing dramatic, just small, steady tasks that made her life easier. She never made a big performance out of gratitude. Instead, she would simply say something like, "You noticed the details, Matilda." I didn't think much about those words at the time, but looking back now, I realized she was saying something very specific, because noticing details can be a quiet kind of power, especially in a family where most people only pay attention to the loudest voices. To everyone else, I was simply the helpful niece, the calm one, the one who didn't argue, the one who would probably continue doing exactly what she'd always done. Which is why, when my Aunt Carolyn gathered everyone together that afternoon and confidently announced her plan to sell Grandma's house, no one thought to look at me. Not even once. And at the time, I didn't say a single word. The announcement happened on a Sunday afternoon. It was one of those grey Portland days, when the sky looks like it might rain, but never quite decides to. We were all gathered in my grandmother's living room, the same room where every Thanksgiving dinner had ended with someone half asleep in the armchair and the smell of cinnamon still lingering in the air. Only this time, the house felt different, quieter, hollow in a way that was hard to explain. Grandma had passed away 3 months earlier. The routines of grief had already come and gone. The funeral, the casseroles, the polite condolences from neighbors who spoke softly at the door. Now what remained was the practical part. The part families rarely talk about until they're forced to. Carolyn stood near the fireplace holding a folder. I remember noticing that first. Folder. Carolyn liked documents. She liked looking prepared. She liked the sense that she was guiding everyone toward the next step. "All right," she said, clapping her hands once lightly. "Let's talk about the house." Her voice carried that familiar tone of calm authority. Everyone instinctively shifted their attention toward her. My cousin Daniel leaned back on the couch. My mother folded her hands in her lap. Someone in the kitchen turned down the kettle. Carolyn opened the folder. "I've spoken to a realtor," she said. "The market's strong right now, and it really doesn't make sense to hold on to the property." She said property, not Grandma's house, not the place we grew up visiting, just property. "It's an old house," she continued. "It'll need repairs eventually, and none of us live here anymore. Selling it now will be simpler for everyone." Her reasoning was tidy, logical, efficient. And most of the room reacted the same way people do when someone confident presents a clear plan. They nodded. Daniel shrugged. My mother sighed softly but didn't object. Carolyn flipped another page in her folder. "I've already scheduled a meeting with a notary in a couple of weeks, so we can handle the paperwork together." She said it casually, as the decision had already settled itself. That was the moment something small shifted in my chest. Not anger, not even disagreement, just awareness. I was sitting in the wooden chair beside the window, the one Grandma used to knit in during the evenings. From there, I could see the backyard, the old apple tree bending slightly in the wind. I waited for someone to mention something, maybe ask a question, maybe suggest we take more time. But the room stayed calm, accepting, like a train quietly pulling away from a station. Carolyn looked around the room with a satisfied expression. "Does anyone have any concerns?" There was a pause. It wasn't a long pause, but it was long enough for my name to quietly rise in my own thoughts. Because if anyone in that room had spent time in this house recently, it was me. If anyone had seen the small repairs that had already been made, the paperwork Grandma had carefully kept in labelled envelopes, the conversations she and I had shared in the kitchen late at night, it was me. But no one looked at me. Not my mother, not my cousin, not even Carolyn. I realised something in that moment that I hadn't quite understood before. They didn't expect me to have an opinion. To them, I was the person who handled things after decisions were made. The organizer, the helper, the one who would probably assist with the paperwork when the time came. Carolyn closed the folder. "Great," she said. "I'll email everyone the details for the notary appointment." The conversation shifted almost immediately. Daniel started talking about work. Someone asked what we should do with Grandma's old furniture. The house returned to the comfortable noise of family logistics. And I stayed quiet. Not because I had nothing to say, but because something about the moment felt incomplete. Like a page had been turned before the previous one had fully finished. When the gathering finally ended, I stayed behind for a few minutes. The others were already leaving. Car doors closing, engines starting, the familiar rhythm of people returning to their separate lives. I walked slowly through the hallway toward the kitchen. The house smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. Someone, probably Carolyn, had already started preparing it for sale. I rested my hand briefly on the kitchen counter. This was where Grandma used to spread out her mail every Tuesday afternoon. Bills, letters. She asked me to help explain the documents. And suddenly I remembered something small, something ordinary, something that at the time had felt unimportant. A conversation we had about papers, about records, about making sure certain things were kept safe. It wasn't a dramatic memory, just a quiet one. But in that moment, standing alone in the kitchen, the thought returned with unexpected clarity. And I realized something. The conversation that had just happened in the living room was not the whole story. Not even close. Still, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. Because the truth is, the first small cut in a situation like this rarely comes from what someone says. It comes from what they assume you'll never say back. And Carolyn had just made one very clear assumption about me. She assumed I would stay exactly where she had always placed me. Quiet. Helpful. Out of the way. At the time, I let her believe that. In the weeks after that Sunday gathering, life returned to something that looked almost normal. At least on the surface. Carolyn sent a group email 2 days later with the subject line, "Next steps, house sale." It was written the same way she always communicated important things. Organized, efficient, polite in a way that didn't leave much room for discussion. She had attached 3 documents, a property evaluation, a suggested listing timeline, and the appointment confirmation with the notary. 2 weeks from now, Thursday morning, 10:30 a.m. Her message ended with a cheerful sentence. "This should make everything simple and fair for everyone." Several family members replied with quick confirmations. Daniel wrote, "Works for me." My mother responded with a short, "Thank you for organizing this." I didn't reply. Not because I disagreed with anything in the email, but because something about the tone of it all felt strangely familiar. It reminded me of something I'd seen many times before, not just in families, but at work. Once a decision is announced with confidence and paperwork, people tend to assume the thinking has already been done. They move straight to cooperation. Questioning the plan suddenly feels like unnecessary conflict, and most people prefer peace over curiosity. A few days later, Carolyn called me, not to ask my opinion, to ask for help. "Matilda," she said warmly, "you're good with documents. Do you think you could stop by the house this weekend and gather any old paperwork your grandmother might have kept? Tax records, maintenance receipts, things like that." Her voice carried the casual certainty of someone assigning a task. I hesitated for a moment before answering. "Of course," I said. It was exactly the kind of thing I had always done. And Carolyn knew it. Saturday morning, I unlocked the front door and stepped into the quiet house again. The realtor had already visited earlier that week. The living room furniture had been rearranged slightly to make the space feel larger. The windows were open to let fresh air in. The house was beginning the strange transformation that happens when a place stops belonging to a family and starts becoming a listing. I walked into the kitchen. Grandma's old desk sat in the corner near the back window. It wasn't large, just a narrow wooden desk with 2 drawers and a small cabinet underneath. She had always kept her important papers there. I pulled open the first drawer. Inside were the kinds of documents you expect from someone who lived carefully and kept records of everything. Insurance papers, utility bills, medical statements. Each one was neatly placed in labeled envelopes. I began sorting them into small piles across the desk. Mortgage history, repair receipts, property tax records. The quiet rhythm of organizing documents settled my thoughts. This was familiar work for me. But as I continued going through the files, I noticed something that made me pause. Some of the documents had small notes written in my grandmother's handwriting. Short reminders, dates circled. Occasionally, a single word is written in the margin. Paid. Filed. Matilda helped. I felt a small ache in my chest seeing those notes. They weren't grand gestures, Just tiny acknowledgements of moments we'd shared handling ordinary things together. I kept working. The bottom drawer was harder to open. It stuck slightly before sliding forward. Inside were older folders, documents that hadn't been touched in years. Home inspection reports, original renovation permits from decades ago. I placed them gently on the desk and continued sorting. An hour passed quietly, then another. By the time sunlight began slanting across the kitchen floor, I had organized most of the records Carolyn had asked for. I was about to close the final folder when I noticed something unusual. Tucked behind the last stack of papers was a thin envelope. It wasn't labeled, and unlike the other documents, it looked newer. The paper wasn't yellowed with age. It was crisp, carefully sealed. For a moment, I considered leaving it where it was. After all, Carolyn had only asked for financial records. But something about the envelope made me pause. Not suspicion exactly. Just curiosity? I turned it over in my hands. My grandmother's handwriting appeared on the front. Only 2 words. Important. Later. I stood there for a moment in the quiet kitchen. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street. The apple tree branches brushed lightly against the window. I realized something then. In our family, Carolyn had slowly become the person who explained what things meant. What decisions were logical? What outcomes made sense? And over time, everyone else, including me, had grown used to accepting that explanation. But standing there with that envelope in my hands, a different thought surfaced. What if there were details Carolyn had never considered? Not because she was hiding something, but because she had never thought to look for it. I slid the envelope carefully back into the drawer, closed it, and finished gathering the paperwork Carolyn had asked for. When I left the house later that afternoon, I sent her a quick message. I found the property records and maintenance files. I'll bring them to the notary appointment. She replied almost immediately. Perfect. I knew I could count on you. Reading that message, I realized something quietly uncomfortable. The role they had given me in this situation was the exact role that allowed me to see everything, and none of them had noticed. Over the next 2 weeks, something subtle settled into place. It wasn't announced. No one discussed it openly. But everyone behaved as though the structure of the situation had already been decided. Carolyn was in charge, and I was helping. It showed up in small ways. Group messages would arrive with short instructions. Matilda, could you bring the repair records? Matilda, do you still have Grandma's insurance file? Matilda, do you mind checking the tax statements? Every request sounded polite, grateful even, but none of them contained a question that really mattered. No one asked what I thought about selling the house. No one asked if I had noticed anything unusual while going through the documents. And the more time passed, the clearer the pattern became. In our family system, my role was not a decision maker. My role was facilitator, the person who ensured that other people's decisions could move forward smoothly. It wasn't something anyone had consciously assigned. Roles like that almost never are. They grow slowly over time, shaped by personality, habit, and convenience. Carolyn had the loudest confidence. Daniel preferred staying out of complicated family conversations. My mother avoided conflict whenever possible. And I had spent years proving that I could quietly carry responsibility without making things difficult. When people learn that about you, they rarely stop to ask whether you're comfortable with it. They simply continue relying on it. One evening, a few days before the notary appointment, my mother called. Her voice sounded tired in the way it often did when she was trying to balance emotions she didn't want to show. Carolyn says you've been helping organize Grandma's records, she said. I have, I replied. There was a pause on the other end of the line. You've always been good with those things, she continued gently. I could hear the unspoken meaning inside the compliment. Reliable, practical, the one who handles details so others don't have to. Then she added something else. Your aunt is just trying to make everything simple. I know, I say. And I did know. Carolyn genuinely believed she was helping the family move forward efficiently. She believed the house was an asset that needed to be managed responsibly. In her mind, organizing the sale quickly was the mature thing to do. The logical thing, the responsible thing. And because she believed it so confidently, everyone else had slowly adjusted their expectations around that belief. Even me, at least until recently. After the call ended, I sat quietly at my kitchen table for a while. The leather notebook I carried everywhere rested beside my coffee mug. I had owned that notebook for years. Originally, it was just a place to keep small reminders, grocery lists, work notes, things I didn't want to forget. But over time, it had become something else. A place where I wrote observations, Not judgments, just facts, dates, conversations, details that might matter later. I opened the notebook and flipped through a few pages. Some entries were mundane, a reminder about Grandma's prescription refill, a note about a plumber who had fixed the kitchen sink 2 years earlier. But then I reached a page written about 8 months before my grandmother passed away. The memory came back immediately. We had been sitting at the kitchen table together while she sorted through old folders. She had looked unusually thoughtful that afternoon. "Matilda," she said, tapping a stack of papers gently with her finger. "Sometimes people assume the loudest voice understands everything." I remember smiling slightly. Grandma had always been good at quiet observations like that. "But paperwork," she continued, "has its own language." She slid one particular document across the table toward me. "Promise me you'll always read things carefully." I had nodded without thinking much about it. At the time, it had felt like a general life lesson, the kind older people share when they're thinking about the future. But now, sitting alone at my table weeks later, the memory carried a different weight, because suddenly I realized something important. The role my family had assigned to me, the quiet organizer, the detail manager, came with a strange advantage. I was the one holding the records. I was the one who had spent years helping Grandma review her paperwork. I was the one who had seen things others never bothered to read. And in situations involving houses, inheritance, and legal decisions, details matter. I closed the notebook slowly. For the first time since Carolyn's announcement, I allowed myself to ask a question I had been avoiding. What if the role they gave me was not the role they thought it was? Because from their perspective, I was simply preparing documents for the notary appointment, helping the process move smoothly, making sure everything was ready. And in a way, that was exactly what I was doing. I was making sure everything was ready, including the things no one else had noticed yet. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no dramatic discovery, no sudden confrontation, no moment where the truth exploded into the room and changed everything instantly. Real changes rarely happen that way. Instead, it happened on a quiet Tuesday morning, 4 days before the notary appointment. I had taken the morning off work, so I could stop by my grandmother's house one more time. Carolyn had asked if I could double-check the document folders and make sure everything was neatly organized for Thursday, which again was exactly the kind of task people expected me to handle. The weather had turned colder that week. When I unlocked the front door, the house felt cooler than usual, the air still carrying the faint smell of old wood and lemon cleaner. Empty houses always sound different. Every step echoes slightly more than it used to. I walked slowly through the living room, past the fireplace where Carolyn had stood during the announcement, and into the kitchen. Grandma's desk was still there. The folders I had organized on Saturday remained stacked neatly in the same place. For a moment, I simply stood there, not working, just listening to the quiet. When someone dies, their house becomes a strange kind of museum. Every object holds the shape of a life that used to move around it. The kettle, the worn chair by the window, the small ceramic bowl where Grandma used to keep loose change. And suddenly something unexpected happened. Instead of feeling sadness, I felt clarity. Not anger, not resentment, just a calm understanding that had been slowly forming in the background of my mind for weeks. I realized something simple. The story my family believed about this house was incomplete. Not wrong, just incomplete. They believed the house was an asset that needed to be sold, a practical responsibility that no one wanted to manage long term. They believed Carolyn had stepped forward to handle it, and they believed I was simply helping with the paperwork. From their perspective, everything was orderly, logical, but standing there in the kitchen, I saw the situation differently. Because I had spent the last 2 years sitting at this very desk with Grandma, reviewing documents, reading letters, helping her understand the legal language that had always frustrated her. During those afternoons, she had talked about many things: her childhood, her regrets, her hopes for the family after she was gone. At the time, those conversations felt personal, emotional, but now I realized they had also been intentional. Grandma had been organizing more than memories. She had been organizing information. I opened the bottom drawer of the desk again, the one that stuck slightly when pulled. Inside were the older folders I had already sorted through, and behind them, exactly where I remembered leaving it, was the thin envelope with her handwriting. Important, later. I picked it up again. This time I didn't hesitate. I sat down in her chair, the same chair where she used to lean back after we finished reviewing documents, smiling softly like someone satisfied that something important had been handled properly. The envelope opened easily. Inside was a folded document. At first glance, it looked like a legal form, the kind printed on thick paper with official formatting along the edges. But what caught my attention immediately was the date. It had been signed 9 months before Grandma passed away. My eyes moved slowly across the page. Legal language always requires patience, sentence by sentence, clause by clause. But as I read, something inside me became very still. Not shocked, just focused. Because the document didn't contradict what Carolyn believed. It didn't accuse anyone of wrongdoing. It didn't create conflict. What it did was something quieter. It clarified something that had never been discussed out loud in our family. And the moment I finished reading it, I understood exactly why Grandma had written "important saying later" on the envelope. She hadn't intended for it to start an argument. She had simply intended for it to exist, for the right moment. I folded the paper carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. Then I leaned back in the chair and looked around the kitchen. Sunlight had begun to fall across the counter, warming the wood in the same gentle way it had every afternoon for decades. For the first time since Carolyn's announcement, I realized something important. I didn't need to confront anyone. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't even need to change the plan. All I needed to do was allow the process everyone had agreed to continue exactly as scheduled. The notary appointment, the paperwork, the signatures, everything. Because sometimes the clearest truth reveals itself not through confrontation, but through a simple question asked at the right moment. And now I knew something no one else in the family realized yet. Thursday's meeting wasn't going to unfold the way Carolyn expected. Not because I was going to stop it, but because of a detail she had never considered. Was already waiting inside the documents. I closed the desk drawer gently and stood up. Before leaving the house, I walked once more through the living room. The afternoon light fell softly across the floorboards. For a moment, I imagined Grandma sitting in her usual chair, watching everything with the quiet patience she had always carried. And I realized something that surprised me. For the first time since all of this had started, I felt completely calm. After that Tuesday morning, something about my silence changed. Before it had been a habit, now it was deliberate. There's a subtle difference between the two. When silence is a habit, it usually comes from hesitation, the instinct to avoid conflict, to let louder voices take the lead. But when silence becomes a choice, it feels very different. It becomes steady, intentional, almost calm. Over the next few days, my family continued moving forward with the plan exactly as Carolyn had laid it out. Group messages kept arriving. Reminders about the appointment. Discussions about possible listing prices. Speculation about what the house might sell for in the current market. The tone was practical, even optimistic. From their perspective, the situation was simple. Finalize the paperwork, list the property, divide the proceeds. And because I continued behaving exactly as they expected, helpful, organized, cooperative, no one had any reason to suspect that anything had changed. On Wednesday evening, Carolyn called again. "Just checking in," she said. "Did you manage to gather everything?" "I did, but..." And I replied, "Perfect," she said with relief. "You've always been the reliable one." There it was again. That phrase, reliable. People often mean it as praise, but sometimes it carries another message underneath. Predictable, safe, unlikely to challenge the plan. Carolyn continued speaking, her voice relaxed now that the process was nearing completion. "The realtor thinks we'll get a good price. Honestly, it's probably the best outcome for everyone." "I'm sure it will be," I said calmly. Another short pause. "Are you bringing the documents tomorrow?" she asked. "Yes." "Great. That should make the meeting quick and easy." Quick and easy. The words lingered for a moment after the call ended. I looked at the folder resting on my dining table. Inside were the records Carolyn had asked for. Property taxes, maintenance receipts, insurance papers, all neatly organized. And inside my leather notebook, tucked carefully between 2 pages, was the other document, the one from the envelope, the one that had quietly changed everything. I hadn't shown it to anyone. Not my mother, not Carolyn, not even Daniel. Not because I was hiding it, but there was no reason to reveal it early. Legal processes have their own rhythm. Interrupting that rhythm too soon can create confusion, arguments, and emotional reactions that distract from the facts. But when the moment arrives naturally, when the right person asks the right question, the truth tends to speak for itself. Thursday morning arrived with a steady drizzle tapping lightly against my apartment windows. I dressed simply, dark slacks, a light grey sweater, nothing formal, but neat enough for a legal appointment. Before leaving, I slipped the leather notebook into my bag. Then I paused for a moment, Sometimes when people know something important is about to happen, they feel nervous. Anticipation, adrenaline. But that morning I felt none of those things. Instead, there was only a quiet sense of completion. The process Carolyn had started was about to reach its natural conclusion. And I wasn't there to stop it. I was simply there to make sure everything was fully understood. The notary's office was located downtown, in a small brick building with tall windows and a polished wooden door. By the time I arrived, most of the family was already there. Carolyn stood near the reception desk, speaking confidently with the notary's assistant. Daniel was scrolling through his phone. My mother sat quietly in one of the chairs, her hands folded in her lap. When Carolyn noticed me, she smiled with visible relief. "Matilda," she said, walking over quickly. "Good. I was hoping you'd bring the paperwork." "I did," I said, handing her the organized folder. She flipped through the documents briefly, nodding with satisfaction. "Perfect. This is exactly what we need, and that's what we need." Then she added something casually, almost as an afterthought. "I don't know what we'd do." Again, it sounded like gratitude. But in that moment, I understood something very clearly. Carolyn truly believed she understood the entire situation. She believed every necessary detail had already been accounted for. And because I had remained calm, cooperative, and quiet throughout the process, she never once wondered if there might be one detail she had overlooked. The notary appeared a moment later and invited us into the conference room. A long wooden table filled the center of the room. Stacks of documents waited neatly arranged in front of several chairs. Everything was orderly, professional, routine. From the outside, it looked like any other property signing. Just another family finalizing paperwork after the passing of a relative. But as I took my seat and placed my bag gently beside the chair, I realized something important. Silence, when used carefully, has a strange effect on situations like this. It allows people to continue confidently, right up until the moment they discover the full picture. And sometimes that discovery begins with something very small. Not an accusation, not a speech, just a single question. The notary adjusted his glasses, looked around the table, and began reviewing the documents. Everything was moving exactly as Carolyn expected, at least for now. Looking back now, I realized something important about those 2 weeks before the notary appointment. From the outside, it looked like nothing was happening. No arguments, no family tension, no dramatic discoveries, just quiet preparation. But preparation, when done carefully, often happens where no one thinks to look. After finding the document in my grandmother's desk, I didn't rush to conclusions. Legal papers can look significant without actually changing anything. So the first thing I did was exactly what Grandma had taught me. I read it again, slowly, line by line. Then I read it a third time. The language was formal, but clear enough once you understood how these documents were structured. There were no emotional statements inside it, no long explanations. Just facts, dates, signatures, witnesses, and one very specific clause. At that point, I still didn't assume anything. So the next day, during my lunch break, I visited the county records office. It's a quiet place most people never think about. A building full of public documents that only lawyers, real estate agents, and the occasional curious citizen bother to read. The clerk behind this counter was polite but uninterested in my story. To her, this was routine. I gave her the property address. She pulled up the record history on her computer. "What are you looking for exactly?" she asked. "Recent filings," I said. She turned the screen slightly so I could see it. The document appeared there, exactly where it should be, filed properly, registered months ago, official. That moment confirmed something important. Whatever Grandma had prepared, it wasn't private speculation. It had already been entered into the legal record, quietly, correctly, the kind of step someone takes when they want something to be certain, not debated. I thanked the clerk and left. Walking back outside into the afternoon sunlight, I felt something shift inside my thinking. Not triumph, just clarity. Because once you confirm a detail like that, the situation becomes very simple. No one had to believe my interpretation. No one had to trust my memory. The record already existed, and the notary, the one person in the room whose job was to verify documents, would inevitably see it. That's the part my family never noticed. While everyone else was discussing listing prices and realtors, I wasn't building an argument. I was verifying facts. And facts, when documented properly, have a quiet strength of their own. Over the next few days, I continued doing exactly what everyone expected. I gathered Grandma's maintenance records. I organized the insurance statements. I sorted the property tax receipts by year. Each time Carolyn thanked me, I simply nodded. From her perspective, everything was going smoothly. From my perspective, the process was unfolding exactly the way it needed to. One evening, Daniel sent a message in the family group chat. Does anyone know roughly what the house might sell for? Carolyn responded quickly with a number the realtor had estimated. Several people reacted with surprised emojis. Daniel wrote back, "Wow, didn't realize it was worth that much." I read the conversation quietly. Money has a way of focusing people's attention. But even then, no one asked the question that actually mattered. No one asked whether the house could legally be sold the way Carolyn assumed. And honestly, I couldn't blame them. Most families don't examine the legal history of a property. They trust whoever seems most confident. That confidence had always belonged to Carolyn. And because she had stepped forward to manage the situation, everyone else naturally assumed she had already verified the details. But confidence and verification are not the same thing. That difference is almost invisible until the moment it matters. The night before the notary appointment, I opened my leather notebook again. On a blank page, I wrote a short list. Documents to bring, property tax history, maintenance receipts, insurance file. And then beneath those items, one final line. Grandma's document. I closed the notebook and placed it inside my bag. At that point, the preparation was complete. There was nothing else to research, nothing else to organize. The next step didn't belong to me anymore. It belonged to the process itself, because once a notary begins reviewing property documents, they ask certain questions automatically. Ownership verification, existing legal filings, recorded restrictions. These questions aren't dramatic. They're procedural, but sometimes a simple procedural question can reveal something unexpected. And when that happens, the room usually goes very quiet. That's what my family never noticed. While everyone else assumed the story was already finished, the most important detail hadn't even entered the conversation yet. Thursday morning moved with the calm rhythm of something routine. The conference room at the notary's office was quiet, except for the soft rustle of papers and the occasional tap of a pen against the wooden table. Everything about the setting encouraged efficiency. Legal appointments are rarely dramatic. They're designed to move forward step by step, each document reviewed in a predictable order. Carolyn seemed comfortable in that environment. She sat upright in her chair, her folder neatly aligned with the stack of papers the notary had placed in front of her. Every so often, she glanced at the documents with the satisfied expression of someone who believes a process is unfolding exactly as planned. Daniel leaned back slightly, looking mildly bored but cooperative. My mother remained quiet, her hands folded the way they always were during serious conversations. And I sat calmly near the end of the table, my bag resting beside my chair. The notary, a middle-aged man with careful eyes and a measured speaking voice, began explaining the structure of the meeting. "Before we proceed with any signatures," he said, adjusting his glasses, "I'll need to verify the ownership record and confirm that all relevant documents have been provided." Carolyn nodded immediately. "Of course," she said. "We've gathered everything." She gestured lightly toward the folder I had handed her earlier. "I believe my niece organized the records." The notary glanced at me briefly. I returned a small, polite smile. Then he opened the folder and began reviewing the documents. Pages turned slowly. Property tax statements, insurance records, maintenance receipts. Each paper received a quick professional scan before being placed neatly into a second stack. The room remained calm, routine, just as Carolyn had predicted. After several minutes, the notary paused. He typed something into his computer, then looked back at the property file. "Just a moment," he said. His tone hadn't changed, but the pause was slightly longer than the previous ones. Carolyn leaned forward slightly. "Is everything all right?" "Yes," he replied calmly. "I'm simply reviewing the ownership history." That phrase sounded technical enough that no one reacted strongly. Ownership history. It was just another procedural step. The notary continued reading the screen in front of him. Then he looked back down at the folder. "Do you happen to have any additional documents filed within the past year regarding this property?" he asked. Carolyn answered immediately. "No, I don't believe so." She glanced at the stack again. "We brought everything we could find." The notary nodded thoughtfully. "Interesting." That was the first word in the room that carried even the faintest hint of surprise. He turned the computer screen slightly toward himself and read something again. Then he looked up at the table. "I'm seeing a document filed approximately 9 months ago." Carolyn blinked. "A document?" "Yes," he said calmly. "A recorded filing associated with the property title." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across her face. I'm not aware of anything like that, she said. Daniel sat up slightly in his chair. My mother looked confused. The notary tapped his pen gently against the desk. It appears to be a property-related declaration signed by the previous owner. There was a small silence in the room. The previous owner? My grandmother. Carolyn frowned slightly. Well, she said, still confident but clearly searching her memory. If something like that existed, we would have found it while gathering the records. The notary gave a small professional smile. Sometimes documents are filed directly through legal channels and don't remain in the home files. He paused. Then he asked the question that changed the entire atmosphere of the room. Did anyone here assist your grandmother with legal paperwork during the last year of her life? For the first time that morning, several heads turned in the same direction. Toward me. I hadn't spoken since the meeting began. I simply sat there, calm. The same quiet niece everyone expected. The one who organized documents. The one who handled details. Carolyn followed their gaze and gave a small shrug. Well, she said lightly. Matilda helped her with bills sometimes, but nothing formal as far as I know. The notary nodded thoughtfully. Then he said something simple. If someone assisted with the preparation of that filing, it would be helpful for them to review it. The room grew slightly quieter, not tense, just attentive. For a moment, no one spoke. Then I reached down beside my chair and opened my bag. Inside was the leather notebook. Carefully tucked between 2 pages was the envelope I had found in my grandmother's desk. I placed it gently on the table. No dramatic movement, no speech. Just a simple action, the kind of action someone might take when responding to a routine request. Carolyn looked at the envelope with mild curiosity. What's that? I slid it across the table toward the notary. It might be the document you're referring to, I said calmly. The notary opened the envelope and unfolded the paper. His eyes moved across the page slowly. Professionally. When he finished reading, he nodded once. Yes, he said. This is the filing. Carolyn leaned forward. What does it say? The notary looked around the table for a moment before answering. His voice remained calm. Neutral. Exactly the way a professional speaks when explaining a legal fact. It clarifies the ownership structure of the property. Carolyn blinked again. I don't understand. She said. The notary placed the document carefully on the table. Then he asked one final question. A question so simple it sounded almost harmless. But the moment it was spoken, everything in the room shifted. The notary's question didn't arrive with any drama. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even change his tone. But sometimes the quietest questions carry the most weight. He rested his pen lightly on the document and looked toward Carolyn. Before we continue, he said, I just need to confirm something. Carolyn leaned forward slightly. Yes? He tapped the paper once. Were you aware that your mother filed a life estate transfer with retained beneficiary designation for this property last year? The phrase hung in the air for a moment. Legal language has a strange effect on rooms like that. Most people recognize the seriousness of it without fully understanding what it means. Carolyn blinked. I'm not sure what that means, she said carefully. The notary nodded politely. That's completely understandable. He turned the document slightly so it was easier for everyone to see. This filing establishes that the property remained under your mother's control during her lifetime, but it also names a specific beneficiary who automatically receives the property after her passing. Silence followed. Not the comfortable kind, the attentive kind. Carolyn frowned slightly. Well, that's fine, she said after a moment. We're her children, so that would naturally be the family. The notary shook his head gently. Not necessarily. He pointed to a line near the bottom of the page. The beneficiary named in the filing is one individual. Daniel leaned forward. Who? The notary looked back down at the document. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he spoke calmly. The beneficiary listed here is Matilda Grace Carter. The room became very still. No one reacted immediately. Sometimes people need a moment to translate what they've just heard. Carolyn was the first to speak. That can't be right, she said slowly. Her voice wasn't angry yet, just confused. My mother never mentioned anything like that. The notary nodded again. That's not uncommon. These filings are sometimes arranged privately. He turned the document slightly toward Carolyn so she could see the signature. This appears to be properly signed, witnessed, and recorded with the county. Carolyn stared at the paper. Then she looked up at me. For the first time that morning, the confidence she had carried into the room began to waver. You knew about this? She asked. Her tone wasn't accusatory yet. It was searching, I answered honestly. I knew the document existed. Daniel looked between us. Wait, he said slowly. Are you saying the house here belongs to Matilda? The notary clarified calmly. The document specifies that ownership transferred to Ms. Carter immediately upon the previous owner's passing. My mother inhaled quietly beside him. Carolyn leaned back in her chair, clearly trying to process what she had just heard. That doesn't make sense, she said. She would have told us. The notary didn't argue. He simply pointed to the official filing stamp near the bottom of the page. The document was recorded with the county 9 months ago. That means it became legally binding at that time. Carolyn's eyes moved slowly from the stamp to the signature, to my name, then back to me. The room remained calm. No raised voices, no dramatic confrontation, just a quiet shift in understanding. For weeks, Carolyn had been confidently organizing the sale of a house she believed belonged to the family collectively. But the legal structure of the property had changed months before any of those conversations happened. Not through conflict, not through secrecy, just through paperwork that had been filed properly and quietly. Carolyn rubbed her forehead briefly. So you knew, she said again. Yes, I replied. Why didn't you say anything when we discussed selling it? Her question was sincere. And the answer, for me, was simple. Because the appointment today was already scheduled, I said. The notary glanced between us but remained silent. Carolyn exhaled slowly. So, what happens now? The notary folded his hands on the table. Well, he said calmly, since the property is legally owned by Ms. Carter, any decision regarding sale or transfer would now require her authorization. No one spoke for a moment. Not Daniel, not my mother, not Carolyn. For weeks, the entire plan had moved forward under the assumption that the outcome was already decided. But now the decision point had quietly moved. It no longer belonged to Carolyn. It belonged to me. And the surprising part was, I hadn't come to the meeting to stop anything. I had simply come to make sure the full story was visible. Carolyn looked at me again. Her voice was softer now. Matilda, what do you want to do? That was the moment the room truly shifted, because until then, no one had ever asked me that question. When Carolyn asked me what I wanted to do, the room stayed completely still. Everyone was waiting, not for an argument, not for a dramatic declaration, just for clarity. And that was the interesting part. For weeks, everyone had assumed the decision about the house had already been made. Carolyn had organized the process, scheduled the meeting, and gathered the family. The momentum of the plan had been moving forward like a train on a track. But now the track had quietly shifted, and suddenly the train was waiting. I looked down briefly at the document resting on the table. My grandmother's signature sat at the bottom of the page in the careful handwriting I had watched her practice countless times when filling out forms. There was nothing dramatic about it, just a decision she had made months earlier. Then I looked back up at the room. I haven't decided yet, I said calmly. The words surprised them. Daniel blinked. You mean you might still sell it? Possibly, I replied. Carolyn studied my face, trying to understand something that had suddenly become unfamiliar to her. For years, she had known exactly what to expect from me. Quiet cooperation, practical solutions. But now the situation had changed in a way she hadn't anticipated. The notary cleared his throat politely. If you'd like, he said, we can pause the sale paperwork entirely. There's no obligation to proceed today. I nodded slightly. Yes, I think that would be best. Carolyn sat back in her chair. For a moment, she looked almost relieved, not because the house would necessarily be sold, but because the tension she had been bracing for, an argument, an accusation, never appeared. Instead, everything remained calm, procedural. The way legal matters often unfold is when people allow the facts to speak first. The notary gathered the unused documents into a neat stack. In that case, he said, today's meeting simply becomes a verification of ownership. No further action is required unless Ms. Carter decides to pursue a transaction. He slid the document back toward me. You may want to keep this with your personal records. I folded the paper carefully and returned it to the envelope. No one spoke for several seconds. Eventually, Daniel broke the silence. Well, he said awkwardly, I guess that changes things. Carolyn gave a small nod. Yes, she said quietly, it does. But what struck me most about the moment wasn't the surprise in the room. It was the absence of anger. Carolyn wasn't furious. Daniel wasn't protest. My mother simply looked thoughtful, because the situation hadn't been created by manipulation or deception. It had been created by a legal decision my grandmother made long before any of us started discussing the house. Once the meeting ended, we stepped back into the grey Portland morning together. The rain had stopped, The sidewalk outside the office still glistened with water. Daniel headed towards his car first, still processing the situation. My mother followed slowly behind him. Carolyn and I lingered near the entrance. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she looked at me. "I really didn't know," she said quietly. "I believe you," I replied. She sighed softly. "I thought I was doing the responsible thing." "I know," I said. That was the truth. Carolyn had never tried to take something that didn't belong to her. She had simply been acting on an assumption everyone else had accepted, except for the paperwork. Carolyn folded her arms lightly and looked down the street. "So, what will you do with the house?" I considered the question for a moment. The honest answer was that I still didn't know. Owning something meaningful carries a different weight than managing it. Selling it might still make sense someday, but the decision was no longer about efficiency. Now it was about intention. "I'll take some time to think," I said. Carolyn nodded slowly. "That seems fair." Then she added something I hadn't expected. "You were always the one Grandma trusted with the details." The sentence wasn't defensive. It wasn't bitter, just reflective, as if she had suddenly realized something about the past that hadn't been obvious before. We said goodbye shortly after that. Everyone went their separate ways. And the strange thing about the next few days was how quiet everything became. No urgent messages, no new plans. The momentum that had been pushing toward the sale simply stopped. Not because anyone forced it to stop, but because the decision now belonged somewhere new. And sometimes, when authority moves quietly from one place to another, people need time to adjust to the silence that follows. In the days after the notary meeting, something subtle began to change within the family. No one announced it. No one called a meeting. But the quiet assumptions that had guided everyone before no longer worked the same way. The first sign appeared in the group chat. For weeks, Carolyn had been the one sending updates, listing prices, realtor suggestions, timelines. Her messages always arrived with the same confident tone, as though she was steering the family through a practical process. After Thursday, those messages stopped. The chat grew quiet. At first, it felt like a pause. Then the pause stretched longer. People still talked about everyday things. Birthdays, work schedules, small pieces of normal life. But the house was no longer mentioned. It had quietly become something different. Not a shared logistical problem. Not a property waiting to be sold. It had become a decision that belonged to one person. And because no one wanted to pressure that person, everyone moved carefully around the topic. A week later, Daniel called me. His tone carried the kind of curiosity people have when they're trying to understand a situation without sounding accusatory. "So, are you really keeping the house?" he asked. "I'm still thinking about it," I replied. There was a pause. "You know," he said, "Carolyn really thought selling it was the best option." "I know. But Grandma must have had a reason," he added. "I think she did." Daniel sighed lightly. "Well, whatever you decide, I guess it's up to you now." The conversation ended without tension. But something about it stayed with me afterward. Not the words themselves, the tone. For years, our family conversations had followed a predictable pattern, Carolyn suggested. Others agreed or quietly accepted. The process moved forward. But now that pattern had been interrupted. Not violently, just gently redirected. And people were still adjusting to it. My mother visited my apartment the following Sunday afternoon. She brought tea, the way she always did when she wanted to talk about something without making it feel like a formal conversation. We sat by the window while the rain moved slowly across the glass. For a while, we spoke about ordinary things. Work, her garden, a neighbor's new dog. Then eventually, she asked the question she had been holding. "Did your grandmother ever tell you she planned to leave you the house?" I thought about the afternoons we had spent together at the kitchen table. The documents, the quiet conversations. "She never said it direct," I replied. My mother nodded slowly. "That sounds like her." She stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Your grandmother believed people reveal themselves through the way they handle responsibility." I looked at her. "What do you mean?" "She watched the family carefully," my mother said. "Not critically, just attentively." She smiled faintly. "You were the one who stayed?" The sentence settled gently into the room. Not heavy, just honest. For the first time since the notary meeting, I felt the deeper layer of what had happened. This wasn't just about property. It wasn't even about money. It was about something quieter. Recognition. Grandma hadn't created a dramatic moment. She hadn't announced her decision to the family. She had simply arranged things in a way that would become clear when the time came. And the time had arrived. Over the next few weeks, the shift continued. Carolyn still spoke to me. Our conversations remained polite, but something in her tone had changed slightly. She asked more questions now. She paused longer before making assumptions, not out of resentment, but because the structure of authority in the family had subtly shifted. For years, she had believed she understood every important detail about the situation. Now she knew that wasn't entirely true. And when someone realizes they may have overlooked something important, their confidence naturally becomes quieter. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after the meeting, Carolyn sent me a message. It was short. "Have you visited the house recently?" I replied, "Yes." She wrote back, "How does it feel being there now?" I thought about the empty rooms, the sunlight through the kitchen window, the apple tree in the backyard. Then I answered honestly, "It feels like Grandma is still part of the conversation." Several minutes passed before she replied again. "That sounds like something she would want." And that was the moment I realized something unexpected. The consequences of that day in the notary's office weren't dramatic. No one lost anything suddenly. No one was punished. But the quiet balance of the family had shifted in a way that couldn't be undone. Because once people realized that someone they underestimated was paying attention the entire time, they start listening differently. About a month after the meeting at the notary's office, the situation reached a point that no one could quietly ignore anymore. Until then, everyone had been moving carefully. The house hadn't been mentioned much in family conversations. Carolyn had stepped back from organizing anything related to it. Daniel avoided bringing it up unless we were speaking privately. It was as if the family had entered a silent waiting period. But silence has a limit, especially when something once assumed to belong to everyone suddenly belongs to one person. The moment that broke the quiet came during a Sunday dinner at my mother's house. It wasn't planned as a serious gathering, just the usual meal. Roasted chicken, potatoes, the kind of conversation families have when they're trying to keep things comfortable. Carolyn arrived a little later than everyone else. She greeted everyone politely, sat down at the table, and for a while, the conversation stayed light. Work stories, weather complaints, a neighbor's renovation project. But eventually, the topic that had been hovering quietly in the background surfaced. Daniel mentioned that a new family had moved into the house 2 streets away from Grandma's place. "That neighborhood's getting popular again," he said. "Houses don't stay on the market long anymore." Carolyn set her fork down slowly. "That's true," she said. Then she looked across the table at me. "Matilda," she said carefully, "have you thought more about the house?" The room grew quiet. No one seemed surprised by the question. Just attentive. I nodded. "I have." Carolyn folded her hands together. "What do you think?" Her tone wasn't demanding, but there was something underneath it. A hope that the answer might still align with the plan she had originally imagined. "I've decided not to sell it," I said. The sentence landed softly but clearly. Daniel leaned back in his chair. My mother watched me quietly. Carolyn's expression didn't change immediately, but after a moment she exhaled slowly. "Not now?" she asked. "Not at all," I replied. The room held still for a moment. Carolyn looked down at the table, then back at me. "I just want to understand," she said. "What? Why?" It was a fair question, and the answer wasn't complicated, because Grandma didn't leave it to me as something to liquidate, I said calmly. She left it to me as something to decide about. Carolyn rubbed her temple lightly. "I suppose that's true." There was no anger in her voice, just a realization, because by that point, it had become clear that the situation couldn't be reversed. The document had been filed months before Grandma passed away. Ownership had transferred legally the moment she was gone, and the moment the notary confirmed it in front of the family, the structure of the decision had permanently changed. Carolyn looked around the table slowly. "I wish she had told us," she said. My mother spoke gently. Maybe she thought the paperwork would speak for her. Carolyn gave a small, thoughtful nod. "That sounds like Mom." The conversation drifted into silence for a moment. Then Daniel said something that captured the situation perfectly. "Well, I guess the house ended up exactly where it was meant to be." No one argued with that, because at this point, there was nothing left to debate. Not legally, not emotionally. The plan Carolyn had organized weeks earlier had quietly dissolved the moment the notary read that document aloud. And once something like that becomes visible, once everyone understands how the pieces actually fit together, there's no way to return to the previous assumption. Later that evening, as people began leaving, Carolyn walked with me toward the front door. She stopped for a moment before stepping outside. You know, she said thoughtfully, I kept replaying that moment in the notary's office. The question he asked. She nodded. I thought I understood everything about the situation. Then she smiled faintly, but apparently I didn't. Her tone wasn't bitter, just reflective. And that was the final stage of the realization. Not anger, not regret, just acceptance that the story had always been slightly different from what she believed. Sometimes people discover that truth gradually. Sometimes it arrives in a single sentence spoken across a conference table. But once it arrives, it's too late to fix the assumptions that came before it. The real confrontation didn't happen at the dinner table, and it didn't happen in the notary's office either. Those moments had simply revealed the truth. The actual conversation, the one that mattered most, happened quietly about a week later. Carolyn asked if we could meet at the house, just the two of us. I arrived in the early afternoon. The sky was clear that day, and sunlight filtered through the tall maple trees lining the street. The house looked exactly the same as it always had. The porch steps are slightly worn. The old brass mailbox is still hanging crookedly beside the door. Nothing about the outside suggested that anything significant had changed. But inside, the meaning of the house had shifted. I unlocked the door and stepped in. Carolyn was already standing in the living room. She had her hands in the pockets of her coat, looking around slowly. The way people do when they're revisiting a place that suddenly feels unfamiliar. Hi, she said. Hi. For a moment, we simply stood there. Then she walked toward the window and looked out at the backyard. That apple tree is still there, she said quietly. It is. Grandma had planted it nearly 40 years earlier. Every autumn, she used to insist on baking pies, even when the apples were slightly too small or slightly too sour. Carolyn smiled faintly at the memory. Then she turned back toward me. I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened, she said. Her voice was calm, measured, not defensive. I realized something, she continued. When I announced the sale, I never once asked if anyone else had a different understanding of the situation. I didn't interrupt. She wasn't asking for reassurance. She was simply speaking the realization out loud. I just assumed, she said, that if something important had changed, I would have known. She glanced toward the kitchen. You were the one helping Mum with paperwork near the end, weren't you? Yes, Carolyn nodded slowly. That makes sense now. There was no accusation in her tone, just a quiet rearranging of the story she had believed before. I thought I was taking responsibility, she said. You were, I replied. She looked at me carefully. But you were already carrying a different kind of responsibility. The sentence lingered between us, because that was the part she hadn't seen before. For years, I had been handling small, invisible tasks for the family. Sorting mail, reviewing documents, explaining confusing forms. Those things rarely looked important from the outside. But they were the reason Grandma had trusted me with something larger. Carolyn walked slowly through the living room, her footsteps echoing slightly in the quiet space. Then she stopped near the fireplace, the exact place where she had stood the day she announced the sale. I keep thinking about that moment, she said. When the notary read the document, she gave a soft laugh. I've never seen a room go so quiet so quickly. I smiled slightly. It was unexpected. Yes, she agreed. Then she studied me for a moment. Were you angry at me? The question was simple. Honest. No, I said. Not even when I announced the sale like it was already decided. I shook my head. You were working with the information you had. Carolyn exhaled slowly. That's generous of you. For a moment, she looked around the room again. Then she said something that surprised me. You know, if the roles had been reversed, I'm not sure I would have handled it as calmly as you did. There was no pride in her voice, just acknowledgement. And that was the closest thing our family ever came to confrontation about the house. No shouting, no accusations, just two people standing in the quiet place where everything had started, recognizing how easily assumptions can shape a story. Eventually, Carolyn walked toward the door. Before leaving, she turned back one last time. You know what the strangest part is? She said. What? For years, I thought you were the quiet one in the family. She smiled slightly, but it turns out you were just the one who was paying attention. Then she stepped outside into the afternoon sunlight, and the house returned to silence again. A few months have passed since that afternoon in the house with Carolyn. Life has settled again, the way it always does after something quietly important happens. But something about the way people see me has changed. Not dramatically. No one in the family suddenly started treating me like a different person overnight. But the small assumptions that used to shape my role have faded. When family decisions come up now, people pause. They ask questions. They look in my direction sometimes. Not because I demand attention, but because they know I might notice something others haven't. And strangely, that change didn't come from anything I said. It came from what I didn't say. For years, I thought being quiet meant being overlooked. Now I understand something different. Silence can also mean patience, observation, the willingness to let the full picture reveal itself before reacting. That lesson has changed the way I see myself. Before all of this happened, if someone had asked who I was in my family, I probably would have described myself the way others did. Reliable, helpful, the one who handled details. But now I realize those descriptions were only the surface. What they called handling details was actually something deeper. I was paying attention, not just paperwork, to people, to patterns, to the quiet responsibilities that often go unnoticed until they suddenly matter. And the house itself has slowly become part of that understanding. I visit it every few weeks, not because I feel obligated, but because being there still feels like stepping into a conversation that hasn't quite ended. The kitchen looks the same as it always did. Sunlight still moves across the counter in the afternoon. The apple tree in the backyard still leans slightly toward the fence, just like it did when I was a child. Sometimes I sit at the old desk and read through the same folders Grandma used to sort through with me. Her handwriting still appears on some of the envelopes. Small notes, simple reminders. Paid, filed, Matilda helped. Those words used to feel ordinary. Now they feel like quiet acknowledgements of something she understood long before the rest of the family did. Grandma didn't choose me because I was louder or stronger or more assertive. She chose me because I stayed, because I listened, because I noticed the details that others passed by. And when I think about the moment in the notary's office, the moment everything shifted, I realize something important. It wasn't the document that changed how people saw me. It was the realization that I had been carrying responsibility long before anyone noticed. Responsibility that didn't come with announcements or authority. Just quiet attention. The truth is, I'm still the same person I was before. I still keep my leather notebook with me everywhere. I still prefer listening before speaking. I still believe that most situations reveal their truth if you give them enough time. The difference now is simple. I understand the value of that quietness. And so do the people around me. If you had asked me a year ago how this story would end, I probably would have imagined something much louder. A family argument, a confrontation, people choosing sides. But that's not what happened. Instead, everything changed because of a single question asked at the right moment. And because of a detail that had been sitting quietly in the background long before anyone realized it mattered. That's the part of the story that stays with me. Not the document itself, not the surprise in the room when the notary read my name, but the way something so small, a line in a legal filing, a signature on a page, revealed an entirely different version of the story everyone thought they understood. For years, my family saw me as the quiet one, the helper, the one who organized things after decisions were made. And honestly, I never fought that role. Not because I lacked opinions, but because I believed something my grandmother had taught me long ago. If you pay attention long enough, the truth usually shows itself. Sometimes through actions, sometimes through patterns, and sometimes through paperwork that no one else thought to read. My aunt wasn't a villain in this story. She was simply confident in the version of events she believed to be true. And most of the time, confident people aren't wrong on purpose. They're just moving forward with incomplete information. The real lesson for me came from realizing something deeper. Quiet people are often mistaken for passive ones, but there's a difference between being silent and being unaware. Sometimes the person who says the least in the room is the one who understands the most about what's really happening. My grandmother seemed to know that. That's why she never made a big announcement about her decision. She simply put the truth where it belonged, in the record, and trusted that when the time came, the right question would bring it into the light. Today, the house is still standing exactly where it has always been. The apple tree still leans toward the fence. The kitchen still fills with warm sunlight in the afternoon. And every time I sit there, I think about how quietly some of the most important moments in life unfold. Not with shouting, not with revenge, just with clarity. So now I'm curious about something. Have you ever been in a situation where people underestimated you simply because you were quiet, and then later realized they had misunderstood you all along? I'd really love to hear your story.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.